Imagine a cold island on the edge of Europe. Mists roll through the forests. Scattered tribes live without a single central authority, and nothing hints at the greatness to come. But it is here that the story begins, that will change the entire world. First, the legions of the Roman Empire land on the shore, bringing roads and order. Then come centuries of chaos, invasions, and strife from which a kingdom gradually emerges. Centuries pass, and this wild island transforms into the heart of the British Empire, a realm where the sun never sets. How did this happen? How did the edge of the world become the center of the world? And why is its influence still felt today? In this video, you'll follow the entire journey, from the first tribes to a global empire. If you enjoy this historical analysis, subscribe to the channel and give it a like so you don't miss new stories. Before England was England, there was only the island. Cold, wet, windswept at its edges, dense and dark at its heart. A place that sat at the far northwestern rim of the known world, close enough to the continent to be reached, remote enough to feel like the edge of everything. The Romans, who eventually came to conquer it, called it Britannia, and even they, builders of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever produced, looked at it with a mixture of ambition and unease. It was not an obvious place to change the world. And yet, long before the legions arrived, long before anyone thought to name the island or draw its outline on a map, people had already been living here for tens of thousands of years. The first inhabitants left little behind: flint tools, the remnants of fires, the occasional bone pressed into river sediment. But they were here, moving through a landscape that was, in those earliest millennia, very different from anything recognizable today. At certain points in deep prehistory, Britain was not even an island at all. A land bridge connected it to the continent, and animals and people crossed freely between what would eventually become England and what would eventually become France, with no awareness that they were crossing anything significant at all. Then the ice retreated, the seas rose, and the bridge disappeared beneath the water. The island was born, cut off, self-contained, shaped henceforth by its isolation as much as by anything that happened within it. By the time recorded history begins to take any notice of Britain, the dominant inhabitants are the people we call the Celts. Though that name covers an enormous diversity of tribes, languages, and local traditions rather than any single unified people. They are often misremembered. Popular imagination tends to picture them as primitive, wild-haired warriors charging into battle, smeared in blue woad, screaming into the fog. And there is some truth to the warrior image. Celtic society was deeply martial. Honor, courage in battle, and loyalty to one's tribe were the central values of a culture that had no single written language, no unified political structure, and no interest whatsoever in building the kind of centralized state that the Mediterranean world had come to regard as the mark of civilization. But primitive is the wrong word. The Celts were sophisticated in ways that the Romans, and later many historians, consistently underestimated. Their metalwork was extraordinarily refined. The torques, shields, and ceremonial objects that survive from this period display an artistic sensibility of remarkable delicacy and complexity. Their oral traditions were elaborate, their religious life rich and deeply intertwined with the natural world. The Druids, the learned class who served simultaneously as priests, judges, historians, and keepers of collective memory, underwent decades of training, memorizing vast bodies of law, and cosmology that were considered too sacred to be committed to writing. This was not a primitive culture. It was a different kind of sophisticated culture, one that valued the spoken over the written, the communal over the individual, and the rhythms of nature over the impositions of urban order. The world was organized around the land, villages clustered in valleys or on defensible hilltops. Tribal territories were defined by rivers, forests, and the memories of old boundaries. Kinship was everything. The tribe was the horizon of obligation. You owed loyalty to your chief, your clan, your ancestors. Beyond that border, the world was, if not exactly enemy territory, then at least foreign ground. They did not build roads that connected distant places. They did not need to. The world was not designed for connection. It was designed for depth, for knowing one valley, one forest, one stretch of coastline with an intimacy that no outsider could replicate. And then, one day, the outsiders came anyway. Julius Caesar arrived on the shores of Britain in 55 BC, not to conquer, exactly, but to reconnoiter, to look, to send a message to the tribes that Rome knew they existed, and that Rome's reach was longer than they might have imagined. The expedition was not a great military success, and Caesar himself acknowledged as much. The tides were wrong, the terrain was difficult, and the Britons, whatever their other limitations, were formidable fighters on their home ground. He came back the following year with a larger force and pushed further inland. He extracted promises of tribute from several tribes, declared a kind of nominal victory, and withdrew. Britain remained unconquered. It would stay that way for nearly another century. When the Romans finally came in earnest under Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, they came with overwhelming force and a clear intention to stay. Conquest was neither swift nor complete. The southern and eastern parts of the island fell relatively quickly, the tribal leaders calculating, sometimes correctly, sometimes not, that accommodation with Rome offered better odds than resistance. But the north and west held out far longer, and in some places never truly submitted at all. The rebellion of Boudica in 60 or 61 AD is perhaps the most dramatic illustration of how volatile the occupation remained. Queen of the Iceni tribe in what is now East Anglia, Boudica led an uprising that burned 3 Roman cities to the ground, including Londinium, the future London, and killed by some ancient estimates tens of thousands of people before the Romans regrouped and crushed the revolt with characteristic efficiency. Her defeat was total, but her memory endured. Because even in defeat, Boudica represented something that the Roman project in Britain could never entirely extinguish: the stubborn, furious insistence of a people that this island belonged to them, and that foreign order imposed by force was not the same thing as legitimate authority. The Romans built, as Romans always did. They built with a thoroughness and ambition that transformed the physical landscape of Britain in ways that are still visible nearly 2,000 years later. Roads were the skeleton of the Roman project, straight, engineered, relentless, connecting the new towns and military outposts that the legions established across the island. Watling Street, Ermine Street, the Fossway. These were not merely paths, they were declarations of intent, a statement that this land had been organized, measured, and made legible to a distant power. Towns grew at the junctions, Londinium on the Thames, Eboracum in the north, the future York, Camalodunum in the east, Aquae in the west, where the Romans built elaborate baths around the natural hot springs that the Celts had long considered sacred. The baths at Bath are among the most remarkable surviving Roman structures in northern Europe, and their existence says something important. The Romans were not simply obliterating what came before. They were, in their own way, layering themselves over it, adopting local sacred sites, incorporating local deities into their own pantheon, negotiating with the existing culture even as they dominated it. In the north, where military pressure from the unconquered tribes beyond never fully abated, they built something more explicitly defensive. Hadrian's Wall, commissioned by Emperor Hadrian after his visit to Britain in 122 AD, stretched 73 miles from coast to coast across the narrowest part of northern England. It was one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the ancient world, a continuous barrier of stone and turf, punctuated by forts and watchtowers, garrisoned by thousands of soldiers drawn from across the empire. The wall was not, in the end, primarily a military barrier. Armies could cross it when they needed to. Its deeper purpose was symbolic and administrative, a line drawn on the landscape that said, this side is Rome and that side is not. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman Britain endured. It was never entirely peaceful, never entirely unified, never the smoothly administered province that Rome's administrators might have wished for. But it functioned. Trade moved along the roads. Cities grew and developed their own local characters. A hybrid culture emerged, part Roman, part Celtic, increasingly its own thing, in the villas and markets and shrines scattered across the island. And then, as the 5th century approached, the empire that had built all of this began to come apart. The legions were pulled back, not all at once, but steadily, recalled to defend a core that was itself under pressure from every direction. The last Roman troops left Britain around 410 AD. The administrative apparatus dissolved. The roads remained, but no one was maintaining them. The towns continued, but no one was organizing them. The money economy contracted. The written records thinned and then, for a time, stopped almost entirely. The island that Rome had spent 4 centuries organizing was left, once again, to organize itself. What came next would be darker, stranger, and in some ways more consequential than anything the Romans had built. But that story belongs to the next chapter. When the Romans left, they took order with them. Not immediately, not all at once. The towns they had built did not empty overnight, and the roads they had laid did not crumble in a season. For a time, the structures of Roman life persisted out of sheer momentum. Local administrators attempting to maintain what they knew, communities continuing to use the infrastructure that surrounded them, the memory of empire outlasting the empire itself. But memory fades. Infrastructure without maintenance decays. And the political vacuum left by the withdrawal of Roman authority was not the kind of vacuum that stays empty for long. Into that space came chaos. And after the chaos, slowly, painfully, across centuries of violence and reinvention, came England. The first challenge was not invasion from outside. It was collapse from within. Without the organizing force of Roman administration, Britain fragmented. The island had never been a single political entity under the Celts, and 4 centuries of Roman rule had not fundamentally changed the underlying reality of tribal loyalties and regional identities. When the external structure was removed, what remained was a patchwork of local powers. Some claiming Roman titles they no longer had the authority to back, others reverting to older tribal patterns, all of them competing for resources in a landscape that was becoming less organized and less productive with every passing decade. The written record thins almost to nothing during this period. Historians call it the Dark Ages, not because it was uniformly violent or culturally barren, but because the light of documentation dimmed so dramatically that we're left squinting at shadows. What we know comes from fragments, a handful of chronicles, the evidence buried in the soil as the slow work of archaeology, reconstructing from pottery shards and post holes what the written sources cannot tell us. What those fragments suggest is a Britain under sustained pressure from internal fragmentation, from the slow deterioration of Roman infrastructure, and increasingly from the sea. They came from the east and the north, from the flat coastlines of what is now Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands. They came in boats that were shallow enough to beach directly on shore, which meant they could land almost anywhere. No harbor required, no warning necessary. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes are the names history has given them, though the reality was more complex than any 3-category system can capture. They were not a single people with a unified purpose. They were related groups sharing broadly similar languages, cultures, and, crucially, a hunger for land. And Britain, in its post-Roman confusion, offered land. The early arrivals may have come as mercenaries, hired by desperate local rulers to fight other threats. This was a common pattern across the collapsing Roman world. Barbarian groups brought in to solve immediate military problems, only to realize that the people who had hired them were weaker than they appeared. Whether invited or not, that the newcomers came in increasing numbers. They settled. They sent word back to their homelands. More followed. The Britons, the Celtic-speaking inhabitants who had lived under Roman rule and retained their own identity throughout, resisted. The resistance was real, and it was sometimes effective. There are traces in the historical record, and more in legend, of British leaders who held back the tide for a generation or more. One of those figures may lie behind the legend of Arthur, not the medieval knight of later imagination, but something older and more austere, a war leader, perhaps cavalry-based, winning battles against the incoming settlers in the late 5th or early 6th century. If such a figure existed, his victories were temporary. The weight of migration was too great, the political fragmentation of the Britons too severe, the momentum of settlement too relentless to be permanently reversed. Over the course of roughly 2 centuries, the map of Britain was redrawn, The Britons were pushed west, into Wales, into Cornwall, into the southwestern peninsula, or absorbed into the new order. The language and culture gradually submerged beneath the Germanic tongue of the newcomers. The eastern and central parts of the island became, slowly and irreversibly, Anglo-Saxon. The kingdoms that emerged from this transformation were not unified. They were numerous, competitive, and frequently at war with one another. Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, Wessex, Sussex, Essex, Kent in the south. The names themselves carry the fingerprints of the people who built them: the East Saxons, the South Saxons, the men of Kent. Each kingdom had its own royal line, its own laws, its own local identity. Allegiances shifted, borders moved, kings rose and fell with brutal regularity. And yet, within this apparent chaos, something was being built. The English language was taking shape, a Germanic tongue, related to the language of the continental homelands, but developing its own distinct character through contact with the remnants of Latin, the Celtic languages of the Britons, and the particular demands of life on this specific island. The language that would eventually become one of the most widely spoken in human history was being assembled, word by word, in the halls and fields of Anglo-Saxon England. The Christian Church was also weaving itself into the fabric of the new kingdoms. Christianity had existed in Roman Britain, and it had survived, particularly in the Celtic West, through the chaos of the invasions. In 597 AD, Pope Gregory I sent a mission to England, led by Augustine of Canterbury, who converted the King of Kent and established the first archbishopric at Canterbury. Over the following century, Christianity spread north and west through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, sometimes through royal conversion, sometimes through the patient work of monks and missionaries. The Church brought more than theology. It brought literacy, Latin learning, manuscript culture, and, critically, a network of institutional continuity that transcended the instability of political borders. Monasteries became centers of scholarship, art, and agricultural organization. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced on a small island off the Northumbrian coast in the early 8th century, stand as testament to the extraordinary cultural flowering that was possible even in this supposedly dark age. Their illuminated pages among the most beautiful objects ever made in Britain. And then, just as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were developing their own coherence, new ships appeared on the horizon. The Vikings came first as raiders. In 793 AD, they struck the monastery at Lindisfarne, the same island that had produced those magnificent Gospels, and the shock reverberated across the Christian world. Here was a kind of violence that the settled kingdoms of England had not prepared for. Fast, unpredictable, striking from the sea with no warning and withdrawing before any organized defense could be mounted. For decades, the raids continued. Monasteries were the primary targets, wealthy, undefended, repositories of gold and silver accumulated through generations of pious donation. The psychological impact was enormous. The physical damage was real. But the Vikings, like the Anglo-Saxons before them, did not remain raiders forever. They settled. The Danelaw, a broad swath of northern and eastern England, came under Viking control. its laws and customs shaped by Scandinavian rather than Anglo-Saxon tradition. York became a Viking city. The two cultures began the slow, complex process of blending. Against this backdrop of Viking pressure, one figure stands apart with particular clarity: Alfred, King of Wessex, later called the Great. Alfred came to power in 871, when the situation was, by any reasonable assessment, nearly hopeless. The Vikings had overrun most of England. Wessex itself was under severe threat. In the winter of 878, Alfred was reduced to hiding in the marshes of Somerset with a handful of followers, a king without a kingdom, his power apparently destroyed. He rebuilt it anyway. Through a combination of military reorganization, diplomatic skill, and sheer tenacity, Alfred turned the tide. He defeated the Viking leader Guthrum at the Battle of Edington, forced a peace that established a defined boundary between English and Danish territories, and then, perhaps more importantly, set about constructing the institutional foundations of a durable state. He reformed the law. He promoted literacy and scholarship. He established a network of fortified towns that could resist future raids. He translated Latin texts into English so that knowledge could reach beyond the monasteries and into a wider world. Alfred did not create a unified England. That work would be completed by his descendants. But he created the conditions in which unification became possible. He demonstrated that the disparate, battered Anglo-Saxon kingdoms could be organized into something more coherent, more resilient, more capable of surviving the pressures that history kept delivering to this complicated island. Out of invasion, fragmentation, faith, and the stubborn will of a king hiding in a swamp, England was beginning to take shape. The name itself, Englaland, the land of the Angles, was coming into common use. The island had a new identity, and it was about to be tested again. In 1066, something happens that changes England forever, not gradually, not across generations, but in a single day, on a single battlefield. This is the Norman conquest, and after it, the country will never be the same again. How it began. When the English King Edward the Confessor died without an heir, 3 men believed the throne was theirs by right. The first was Harold Godwinson, the most powerful nobleman in England, crowned king within days of Edward's death. He had the support of the English lords and the blessing of the local church, but his claim rested more on political convenience than on blood. The second was Harald Hardrada, King of Norway. He argued that an old agreement between Scandinavian rulers gave him a right to the English crown. He was a fearsome warrior, a man whose name alone was enough to silence rooms. He came with a fleet of 300 ships. The third was William, Duke of Normandy, a man born out of wedlock, who had spent his entire life proving that illegitimacy was no obstacle to greatness. He claimed that Edward himself had promised him the throne, and that Harold had once sworn an oath to support that claim. Whether Harold truly made such a promise, or whether he made it under duress, no one can say for certain. But William believed, or chose to believe, that he had been cheated. And he was not the kind of man who accepted betrayal quietly. 2 battles, 1 year. Harold's problem was that his enemies came from opposite directions. Harold Hardrada struck first, landing in the north of England in September 1066. Harold marched his armies nearly 300 miles in 4 days, an extraordinary feat, and caught the Norwegians by surprise at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The English were victorious. Harold Hardrada was killed. The Viking threat was over. But even as Harold celebrated, word came from the south. William had landed. Harold turned his exhausted army around and marched them back south. Some of his advisors urged him to rest, to wait, to gather more men. He didn't listen. Whether from confidence, impatience, or a warrior's instinct to meet danger head-on, he moved fast. Too fast, perhaps. The 2 armies met near the town of Hastings on the 14th of October. William's forces, Normans, Bretons, mercenaries from across northern France, faced the English in a battle that lasted most of the day. The English fought on foot, in a tight defensive formation on a ridge. For hours they held. The Norman cavalry charged and was repelled. The situation looked, at moments, like it might tilt toward Harold. And then an arrow, or so the story goes, struck Harold in the eye. The king fell. The English line broke. The battle was over. In a single afternoon, England had a new ruler, the man who remade England. William was not a gentle conqueror. In the years following Hastings, rebellions broke out across the country. His response was systematic and brutal. In the north, where resistance was fiercest, he ordered what became known as the Harrying of the North. Villages burned, livestock slaughtered, land destroyed. Entire regions were depopulated. Some areas took generations to recover. This William wanted it understood with absolute clarity that resistance was futile. But William was also a builder. He understood that conquest is not just about winning battles. It is about control, and control requires structure. So he set about remaking England from the ground up. The old English nobility was swept away almost entirely. The lands were seized and redistributed to William's Norman followers. A new ruling class was installed, speaking a different language, following different customs, loyal to their duke turned king. The transformation was total and deliberate. Within a generation, nearly every major landowner in England was Norman. To monitor and manage this new kingdom, William commissioned something remarkable, the Domesday Book. Completed in 1086, it was a vast survey of the entire country. Every village, every estate, every mill, every ox. Who owned what, who owed what, who held land, and on what terms. Nothing like it had been attempted anywhere in Europe. It was an instrument of power disguised as an act of administration. William wanted to know exactly what he had conquered. And underneath all of this, he introduced the feudal system in its most rigid form. Land was held from the king, who was the ultimate owner of everything. Lords held their estates in exchange for military service. Below them were knights. Below knights were peasants, bound to the land. Everyone had a place. Everyone had obligations. The pyramid was clear, and William sat at its top. The language of power. One of the most lasting consequences of the conquest was linguistic. Overnight, French became the language of the courts, the law, and the church. English, the language of the conquered, was pushed down. It became the tongue of farmers and servants, of ordinary life. For nearly 3 centuries, the rulers of England spoke French, and yet English survived. It absorbed. It borrowed thousands of French words and wove them into itself. When the two languages finally merged back together, something new emerged. A richer, stranger, more layered tongue than either had been alone. The English language that would eventually produce Shakespeare and later spread across the world was born from this collision. The seed of limits. William's conquest made royal power stronger than it had ever been in England, but it also planted the seed of its own limitation. The king needed his barons. He had given them land, but land created independence. Over time, the men William had rewarded began to expect consultation, respect, a voice. The relationship between the king and his nobles was never simply one of master and servant. It was a negotiation, often tense, occasionally violent. That tension would eventually produce one of the most consequential documents in history. In 1215, King John, weak, unpopular, having lost much of England's territory in France, faced a rebellion by his own barons. They had had enough. They forced him to a meadow called Runnymede, beside the Thames, and made him put his seal to a document that would echo down the centuries. The Magna Carta, the Great Charter of Liberties. It did not create democracy. It was not written with ordinary people in mind. It was a deal between a king and his noblemen, but it contained within it an idea of enormous power, that even the king was bound by the law, that there were rights, for some at least, that could not simply be taken away, that power had limits. From that idea, slowly and painfully over centuries, something extraordinary would eventually grow. But that is a story for later chapters. What the Norman conquest gave England was, paradoxically, both its greatest trauma and one of its greatest strengths. The violence of the conquest to force the country into a new shape, centralized, organized, literate in governance, and the tension between that centralized power and those who lived under it began to generate the ideas that would, in time, make England not just powerful, but genuinely different. The damp island on the edge of Europe was changing. It was learning what it could become. There is a moment in the life of every great power when it stops looking inward and begins to look outward. For England, that moment came slowly, then all at once. For centuries after the Norman conquest, the country had been consumed by its own affairs, wars with France, struggles between kings and barons, the slow grinding work of building a functioning state. England was a significant country, but not yet a world-changing one. It sat on the edge of Europe, perpetually entangled in continental politics, perpetually fighting over scraps of French territory, perpetually turning in on itself. Then, in the 16th century, everything changed. The break that made everything possible. It began, of all things, with a marriage. King Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, who had not given him a male heir. The Pope refused to grant the annulment. Henry, a a man not accustomed to being told no, drew a conclusion that was both bold and convenient. If the Pope would not give him what he wanted, then England did not need the Pope. In 1534, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. With a stroke of the pen, England broke from Rome. The consequences were far larger than one man's marital problems. The Reformation that followed transformed England's identity. Monasteries were dissolved, their wealth seized by the crown. Religious life was reorganized. A new kind of Englishness began to form, one that defined itself partly in opposition to Catholic Europe, particularly to Spain, the most powerful empire of the age. England was now not just geographically separate from the continent, it was spiritually separate, ideologically separate. And that separation gave it room to become something entirely its own. The full flowering of this new England came under Henry's daughter, the age of Elizabeth. When Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, England was a second-rate power with an empty treasury, a divided church, and powerful enemies on all sides. When she died in 1603, it was a confident, outward-looking nation with one of the most feared naval forces in the world. How did this happen? Elizabeth was not a military conqueror in the traditional sense. She was something more elusive and more effective, a master of survival, of image, of timing. She played her potential suitors, foreign kings and princes, against each other for decades, using the promise of her hand as a diplomatic tool while committing to nothing. She cultivated a mythology around herself, the Virgin Queen, married to a kingdom, that her subjects genuinely believed and foreigners found baffling. But beneath the theater of her court, real things were happening. English sailors were pushing further out into the world. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, returning with a ship full of Spanish treasure and a story that electrified the nation. Walter Raleigh was attempting to plant English colonies in the Americas. Merchants were forming trading companies, probing the coasts of Africa, the Persian Gulf, the Indian subcontinent. The sea, which had once been a barrier, was becoming a highway. And then, in 1588, came the moment that confirmed England's new status. Spain sent its armada, 130 ships, the greatest naval force the world had seen, to invade England, depose Elizabeth, and return the country to Catholicism. The English fleet, smaller and faster, met them in the Channel. Bad weather did as much damage as cannon fire. The armada was scattered and destroyed. England had faced the greatest empire on earth and won. The psychological effect was enormous. If Spain could not crush them, who could? The ocean was theirs to claim. The century of turmoil. But before England could fully step into its global role, it had to survive itself. The 17th century was the most violent and unstable in English history since the Norman conquest. The kings who followed Elizabeth, the Stuarts, James I, and then Charles I, believed in the divine right of kings. The idea that their authority came directly from God and could not be questioned by parliament or people. Parliament disagreed, loudly, then violently. The English Civil War broke out in 1642. On one side stood the king and his royalist supporters. On the other stood Parliament and its allies, including a formidable military commander named Oliver Cromwell. The war was brutal, complex, and deeply felt. It was not simply a political dispute, it was a struggle over the most fundamental question a society can ask: who holds ultimate power, and on what basis? In 1649, the question received an answer that shocked all of Europe. King Charles I was put on trial. He was found guilty of treason against his own people, and he was beheaded. A king, an anointed monarch, God's representative on earth, according to the doctrine of the age, had been publicly executed by his own subjects. Nothing like it had happened in any major European country. The continent watched in a mixture of horror and fascination. England briefly became a republic, the Commonwealth, then the Protectorate under Cromwell. But Cromwell was a complicated figure, a genuine believer in parliamentary government who nonetheless ruled, in practice, like a military dictator. When he died in 1658, the experiment faltered. The monarchy was restored in 1660, but it was never the same monarchy. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 settled the matter permanently. Parliament invited a new king, William of Orange, to take the throne on its own terms. The Bill of Rights of 1689 made it explicit. The monarch could not suspend laws, could not maintain an army in peacetime without parliamentary consent, could not interfere with elections. The king reigned, Parliament governed. England had invented something new: constitutional monarchy. And the idea would travel far: the industrial fire. While politicians and kings argued about the nature of power, something was happening in the fields and workshops of England that would ultimately matter more than any of them: the Industrial Revolution. It is difficult to overstate how completely this transformed not just England, but the entire world. For most of human history, the pace of material life had changed slowly. People farmed, built, wove, and worked much as their grandparents had. Then, in the span of a few decades in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, everything accelerated. It began with cloth. Inventors found ways to mechanize the spinning and weaving of cotton, replacing human hands with machines, driven first by water, then by steam. Factories appeared in the Midlands and the north of England. Vast, roaring, smoky buildings that produced in a day what a craftsman might have made in a year. James Watt improved the steam engine in the 1760s, and the consequences rippled outward in every direction. Steam drove the factories. Steam pumped the water out of coal mines, allowing miners to dig deeper. Steam powered the locomotives that began to cross the country on iron rails from the 1820s onwards, compressing distance and time in ways that felt almost supernatural to the people who experienced them. A journey that had taken days now took hours. England had coal, iron ore, and navigable rivers in fortunate proximity. It had a culture of practical tinkering and invention. It had access to colonial markets for its goods and colonial sources of raw material. And it had political stability, relative to the rest of Europe, which was convulsed by revolution through much of this period that allowed capital to accumulate and be invested. The result was that England became, for a time, the workshop of the world. Goods made in Birmingham and Manchester were sold in South America, West Africa, India, and Australia. English engineers built railways on every continent. English banks financed enterprises across the globe. The pound sterling became the currency that international trade was conducted in. London became the financial capital of the world. The empire. And underneath all of this, growing and expanding alongside it, was the British Empire. It had begun modestly enough, a few trading posts, some Caribbean islands, the early colonies of North America. Then, piece by piece, it grew. After the American colonies were lost in 1783, Britain compensated by expanding elsewhere. India became the jewel of the empire, governed first by the East India Company, and then, after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, directly by the British Crown. Australia and New Zealand were settled. Large portions of Africa were claimed, sometimes through negotiation, more often through force. By the late 19th century, the British Empire covered roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and governed roughly a quarter of its population. The phrase that contemporaries used with genuine pride, that the sun never set in the British Empire, was literally true. At any hour of the day, somewhere under British rule, the sun was shining. This was not an enterprise of pure benevolence. The empire was built on exploitation, on the suppression of local cultures and political systems, on the extraction of resources that enriched Britain while often impoverishing the places they came from. The slave trade, in which British merchants played a central and catastrophic role before abolition in 1807, stands as one of history's great crimes. The famines that struck Ireland and India under British governance met at times with indifference or active obstruction of relief, are chapters that no honest history can skip. And yet the empire also spread things that outlasted it: legal systems, railways, the English language, parliamentary institutions, cricket. The consequences, good, bad, and deeply entangled, are still being reckoned with today. What the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries gave England was the confidence of a country that had tested itself against the world and found that it could compete. It had survived religious upheaval, civil war, and the execution of a king. It had beaten the greatest naval power of its age. It had invented industrial production. It had built a global empire. The damp island on the edge of Europe had become the center of the world. But centers do not hold forever. The storms of the 20th century were already gathering on the horizon. Empires do not collapse overnight. They thin out. They stretch. They reach a point where the cost of holding everything together exceeds the strength available to do it. And then, slowly at first, and then with gathering speed, they come apart. For Britain, that process began in the 20th century. A century so violent, so disorienting, so full of change, that even the country that had spent 300 years reshaping the world was left, by the end of it, reshaped beyond recognition. The First World War, the end of certainty, In the summer of 1914, Britain entered a war that almost nobody fully understood and almost everybody assumed would be over by Christmas. It lasted 4 years. The First World War was unlike anything that had come before. Industrial technology, the same steam and iron and mechanical ingenuity that had built the empire, was now turned toward killing on an unprecedented scale. Machine guns, artillery barrages, poison gas, barbed wire. The Western Front became a landscape from nightmare. Miles of muddy trenches stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland, where hundreds of thousands of men died for advances measured in yards. Britain lost nearly 1 million soldiers. Families across the country, from the industrial cities of the north to the smallest rural villages, were torn open by grief. There was almost no community untouched. The names carved into war memorials in every English town and village tell the story more plainly than any history book can. And the men who came back were changed. They had been told they were fighting for civilization, for king and country, for the values that made Britain great. Many of them, standing knee-deep in mud and watching their friends die for a few hundred yards of meaningless ground, found it increasingly difficult to believe. The war did not just kill bodies, it killed a particular kind of confidence, the unquestioned assumption that Britain's way of doing things was naturally, obviously divinely superior. The world after 1918 was not the same world that had gone to war in 1914. And Britain, though technically victorious, was exhausted, indebted, and quietly uncertain of itself in ways it had not been before. The Second World War, the finest hour. 20 years later, it happened again. Worse. Adolf Hitler's Germany had systematically rebuilt its military power through the 1930s, swallowed Austria and Czechoslovakia, and then in September 1939 invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. What followed was the most dangerous moment in modern British history. By the summer of 1940, France had fallen. The British Army had been rescued from the beaches of Dunkirk in a desperate, improvised evacuation. Britain stood alone in Europe against the Germany that controlled the continent from the Atlantic coast to the borders of Russia. Invasion seemed not just possible, but likely. It was in this moment that Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. Churchill was many things, some of them admirable, some of them deeply troubling, particularly regarding his attitudes toward empire and the peoples who lived under it. But as a wartime leader, as a voice capable of articulating what was at stake and stiffening the resolve of a people staring into genuine darkness, he was extraordinary. His speeches from that period still carry electricity. He did not promise easy victory. He promised blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He framed the struggle not as a national interest, but as a defense of something larger: human freedom, the right of peoples to govern themselves, the survival of everything that centuries of painful democratic development had built. Britain did not fall. The Royal Air Force held the German Luftwaffe off in the Battle of Britain through the summer of 1940. The German invasion never came. And when the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor in 1941, the balance began to shift. The war ground on until 1945, leaving Europe shattered and tens of millions dead, including 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, a crime that stands apart from everything else the century produced in its horror and deliberateness. Britain emerged from the Second World War victorious, but victory came at an enormous price. The country was broke. It had borrowed vast sums to fund the war effort. Its cities, London, Coventry, Liverpool, Bristol, bore the scars of German bombing. Its people were tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. They had given everything, twice, in a generation. They wanted something back. The welfare state and a new bargain. What they got in 1945 was a surprise. Winston Churchill, the man who had led Britain through its darkest hours, was voted out of office the moment the war ended. In his place came the Labour Party under Clement Attlee, with a mandate to build something new. What followed was one of the most ambitious programs of social reform in any country's history. The National Health Service was founded in 1948, free healthcare for every citizen, funded through taxation, available regardless of wealth or class. It was a revolutionary idea, and it was greeted with profound hostility by some and profound hope by others. Nearly 80 years later, the NHS remains perhaps the institution that the British people feel most deeply attached to. Alongside it came a broader welfare state, unemployment benefits, pensions, social housing, free secondary education. The idea was simple, even if the execution was complicated, that a civilized society should protect its members from the worst that life could do to them, that poverty and illness should not be a matter of luck or birth. Britain was reinventing itself, not as an empire, but as something it had never quite been before, a country that took seriously its obligations to ordinary people. The empire comes apart. At the same time, the empire was dissolving. India, the jewel in the crown, the source of enormous wealth and the justification for so much of the imperial project, became independent in 1947. Partition divided it into India and Pakistan in an act of hasty border drawing that triggered one of the largest and bloodiest mass migrations in human history. Britain had governed the subcontinent for nearly 2 centuries. It left in a matter of months. Over the following decades, the pattern repeated across Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Colony after colony moved toward independence, some through negotiation, some through prolonged and violent struggle. By the 1970s, the empire was essentially gone. Britain found itself in a strange position, still a significant country, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a nuclear power, the center of a loose commonwealth of nations that had emerged from the old empire, but no longer dominant, no longer the workshop of the world, no longer the force around which global affairs organized themselves. America had taken that role. The 20th century, it turned out, belonged to the United States, finding a new place. The decades after empire was spent, in large part, trying to work out what Britain actually was. It joined the European Economic Community in 1973, tying itself economically to the continent it had spent centuries defining itself against. It experienced the social upheavals of the 1960s. shifts in culture, in attitudes toward race, gender, sexuality, and authority that transformed what daily life in Britain looked and felt like. It went through the industrial decline of the 1970s and 1980s, as the factories and mines that had powered the Victorian age shut down one by one, leaving communities in the north of England, in Wales, and in Scotland hollowed out and struggling. It argued, constantly, sometimes bitterly, about immigration, about identity, about what it meant to be British in a country that was no longer an empire and no longer the center of anything in particular. In 2016, it voted to leave the European Union. The decision exposed deep divisions that had been building for decades between cities and towns, between generations, between different visions of what the country was and what it should be. The debate was raw and unresolved in ways that still echo. And yet London remained one of the great cities of the world, a hub of finance, culture, education, and ideas. English remained the global language, spoken by more people as a second language than any other tongue in history. British universities, British music, British literature, British television. The country's cultural output continued to travel further and carry more weight than its size or economic position alone could explain. The story of England, of Britain, is not a story of simple triumph. It is a story of a small island that through a combination of geography, invention, violence, luck, and genuine brilliance managed to shape the modern world more deeply than almost any other place on earth. That left behind institutions and ideas in a language that spread to every corner of the globe. That also left behind scars in former colonies, in communities left behind by deindustrialization, in the unresolved questions of identity that every post-imperial society must eventually face. The wild island on the edge of Europe never stopped changing. And perhaps that is the deepest truth about it. Not that it was always right, or always powerful, or always just, but that it kept moving, kept adapting, kept asking difficult questions about itself, even when the answers were uncomfortable. That restlessness, more than anything else, is what made it matter. If you enjoyed this journey through English history, if it made you think, sparked your curiosity, or simply kept you reading, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps us grow, reach more people, and keep making content like this. Every like and every new subscriber allows us to go deeper, tell bigger stories, and bring history to life the way it deserves to be told. We're just getting started, and we'd love to have you with us for what comes next.